so I'm going to talk about the bones that make up the cranium, and the cranium is what encloses and protects the brain, as well as serves as attachment sites for the muscles, some of the muscles of chewing, as well as the muscles that move the head. And so the first bone I'm going to mention is when you think of forehead, this bone that makes up the forehead, this is the frontal bone, okay? So it's the frontmost bone. This is the frontal bone. The frontal bone helps make up the anterior, the front of the cranial cavity, the roof of the cranial cavity, as well as portions of the floor of the cranial cavity, as well as the upper walls of the orbital cavities where the eyes would be contained. So this is the frontal bone. Okay. Now, a lot of these terms that I'm going to be talking about should sound familiar when you had to learn all of those anatomical terms for the regions of the body. And when you had to learn those, the forehead was termed frontal, right? So this is the frontal bone. Now I'm going to turn this to where this is the anterior, this is posterior, and I'm going to move backwards. These two bones, as we move posteriorly, these are the parietal bones. So there are two parietal bones, only one frontal bone. And the parietal bones help make up the roof of the cranial cavity as well as the lateral sides of the cranial cavity. Now you'll notice these yellow squiggly lines, and it really does look like sutures, like someone sewed the bones together. And these are they're called sutures, and they're fibrous joints that are immovable, right? And this suture, which separates the frontal from the parietal bones, this is the coronal suture. And when you had to learn how you could cut the body and organs in different sections, this is like a coronal section. This is the coronal suture, okay? Now this suture that separates or fuses the two parietal bones together, this is called the sagittal suture. Remember, a sagittal or a mid-sagittal section, okay? So this is the sagittal suture, which holds together the two parietal bones. Now, as we move even further back, okay, this bone is the occipital bone. So remember, if you learned the back base of the skull, it's termed occipital. This is the occipital bone. And the occipital bone makes up the back, the posterior side of the cranial cavity, as well as a portion of the floor of the cranial cavity. Now, this suture, okay, which outlines the occipital bone. This suture is called the lambdoid suture. And if you know your Greek letters, the Greek letter lambda, you can look it up, Google it, but that's what it's named after, is the Greek letter lambda. This is the lambdoid suture. Now, if we look at the base of the skull, okay, this would all be the floor of the cranial cavity right here. This is still occipital bone back here. And some of the specific structures you have to be able to identify, this huge hole is called the foramen magnum. So a foramen is a hole, magnum means large, so this is a really large hole. And just like all other foramina, it's holes that allow for passage of arteries, veins, nerves. And this foramen magnum allows for the passageway of the brainstem to the spinal cord, which exits through the foramen magnum. Now, on the lateral sides of the foramen magnum, there's these little, somewhat smoother areas right here. These are called the occipital condyles. And the occipital condyles articulate with the facets of C1. So when I say C1, I'm referring to cervical vertebrae 1, right? And on this cervical vertebrae number 1, there's these facets which articulate with these occipital condyles of the occipital bone, okay? So those are the two specific structures of the occipital bone you have to be able to identify. Now I'm going to move to the lateral sides, okay? And this bone right here is the temporal bone, okay? So here's a temporal bone, and it's outlined by this suture called the squamous suture. Okay, now there's a temporal bone on each side. So if I come over here, this is another temporal bone, right? And the temporal bone helps make up the lateral sides of the cranium as well as a portion of the floor of the cranium. And you can see that here. So this is a colored skull, which helps with identification a little bit better when you're first learning. But I have removed the two parietal bones, and I have removed the one frontal bone, okay? So the purple would be the occipital bone, okay? So you can see that the occipital, this would be the foramen magnum, occipital condyles, okay? This pink, these are all temporal, okay? And if we look, this would be the inside of the cranial cavity. This would be the floor where the brain would sit, and you can see that the pink is found on the floor of the cranial cavity. So the temporal bones help make the lateral sides as well as a portion of the floor of the cranial cavity, okay? Now some specific structures that you have to be able to identify. I've already mentioned the squamous suture, but you can also see that there's this tubular channel, okay, that goes through the temporal bone, and this tubular channel is called the external acoustic meatus. The external acoustic meatus, acoustic gives you an idea that it's going to have something to do with sound. This allows for the passage or the travel of sound waves through the temporal bone into the middle ear to vibrate structures, which then gets transmitted to the inner ear so that we can actually hear, send signals to the brain and hear. So this is the external acoustic meatus, which allows for the passageway of sound waves into the middle ear, again, to vibrate structures to send to the inner ear. Now, this little pin-like structure, you've heard this term before, it's a styloid process. But this is the styloid process of the temporal bone. And the styloid process serves as attachment sites for muscles of the tongue as well as the pharynx, and pharynx is a fancy word for the throat. Now this larger process, this is the mastoid process of the temporal bone. And this mastoid process serves as an attachment site for muscles of the neck, and more specifically the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So you don't need to know that specific muscle yet, but when we get to the muscle chapter and you're learning to identify muscles, well, guess what? Sternocleidomastoid, that muscle gives you an idea of where it's located or attached to. Sterno, sternum, cleido, clavicle, mastoid, mastoid process. So this is the mastoid process of the temporal bone. If I go over to the other temporal bone, same structures. External acoustic meatus, styloid process, mastoid process, all of the temporal bone. Okay? Now the last one is this structure that reaches off and of the temporal bone and extends anteriorly. So this would be the anterior, right? This is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Okay? Now, I'm jumping ahead. I'll get to the zygomatic bone in the facial skeleton video, but this is the zygomatic bone, your cheekbone, all right? And this has a process that comes off and extends posteriorly. This would be the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. So it's, somewhat confusing when you're first learning, but it totally makes sense that they named this process for which bone it's going and attaching to. So this is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. This is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, okay? Together, they make up this structure called the zygomatic arch, which is like the arch of your cheekbone, okay? If you have a really prominent cheekbone, it's because you have a really prominent zygomatic arch. So this is the zygomatic arch made of the zygomatic process of the temporal bone and the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, okay? All right, so now I'm going to remove the top of the cranium to look at the other bones. And I'm going to talk about the ethmoid first. So we have to look anteriorly, okay? So this would be the occipital bone, and I know that because I see that huge foramen magnum. This all right here is actually still frontal bone. Frontal bone helps make up a portion of the floor of the cranial cavity as well. Now, sandwiched in between the frontal bone is this triangular outlined area right here. This is the ethmoid bone. Here, you can see the ethmoid bone in white, okay, over here. So this would be right here, ethmoid bone. And you can see that it's not just this more flat structure right here. It actually is very large and just kind of sits into the skull. So this is the ethmoid bone. and we can see it right here. This is the ethmoid bone. So the ethmoid bone helps make up a small region of the floor of the cranial cavity. And if we look in here, it also helps make up the roof of the nasal cavity, okay? And the medial walls of the orbits. So if I look in here, here this is the orbital cavity. Okay, orbital cavity. This structure right here that has the number 15, this is the ethmoid bone, okay? Here, back here, this would be the ethmoid bone, okay? So it sits down into the skull. All right, so some structures you need to identify from the ethmoid bone. This P-shaped structure right here, this is called the crista galli, and the crista galli serves as the attachment site for the meninges of the brain, and the meninges are protective layers of the brain, okay? Now, on the lateral sides of the crista galli, this is called the cribriform plate, and you can see these tiny little holes, okay? And those tiny holes are called olfactory foramina. So, like I said, the ethmoid bone helps make up the roof of the nasal cavity. Well, these olfactory nerves, which provide the information from when odor molecules bind to these receptors, it sends that information to our brain so that we can smell, right? Well, those olfactory nerves, so when we hear olfactory, you want to think sense of smell. Well, those nerves have to get from the nasal mucosa to the brain, and they get to the brain through these tiny holes called olfactory foramina, okay? Now, if the other structures that you have to identify from the ethmoid bone, you have to look inside of the nasal cavity, okay? Now, we can see the nasal cavity is separated into right and left halves. And this structure which separates it into right and left halves is the nasal septum. This upper portion of the nasal septum is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Okay, so it's actually a region of the ethmoid bone that comes down and forms the upper half of the nasal septum. The lower half of the nasal septum down here, this is actually a completely separate bone, which I'll mention again in the facial skeleton video, called the vomer. But this upper half is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Now, on the lateral walls of the nasal cavity and at the top, you'll see these scroll-like structures coming off. These scroll-like structures are called the middle nasal concha of the ethmoid bone. Middle nasal concha of the ethmoid bone. So concha, think conch shell, like it's a scroll-like bone. And it helps with supporting the nasal mucosa of the nasal cavity, as well as increasing the surface area of the nasal mucosa. But this is actually the middle nasal concha of the ethmoid bone. These lower bones, these are completely separate bones, and I'll mention them again in the facial skeleton video. These are the inferior nasal concha, and they're completely separate bones. The middle nasal concha are of the ethmoid bone, okay? And the last bone to mention for the cranium is this big wing-shaped bone, okay? This big wing-shaped bone called the sphenoid bone. So sphenoid bone, you think sphenoid, sphinx, wing-shaped, this big butterfly bone, okay? And if you look over here, it's this yellow bone, right? So it helps make up the floor of the cranium as well, and you can see the lateral sides as well. So here, this is sphenoid, and you can see from the bottom. So it's a huge bone that sits down into the skull. This is the sphenoid bone. Looking at the sides, what would be number 10? This is sphenoid. This is sphenoid, okay? So here's the big sphenoid bone. The only specific structure you have to be able to identify from the sphenoid bone is this carved out region right here, this little saddle. You can see it right here, this little saddle. This is called the sella turcica, and the sella turcica is where the pituitary gland sits. And the pituitary gland is a P-shaped gland that comes off of the base of the brain, and it is extremely important. So we call it the master gland of the endocrine system, and that is protected by this sella turcica. And that's it.